You came to the conclusion that you were irresponsible either way. You chose not to do something. You still fell short. And I'm saying I think Jesus covers both of those sins.
That's a grave sin.
That's not a mortal sin.
That's a grave. Well, let's see. It's a grave sin, objectively speaking. But now the question is,
everybody knows, bro.
Everybody knows.
Right? So what I'm asking you, and I'm not trying to pin you down.
So the answer,
you're saying it can be a mortal sin for someone to pull out.
Ruslan.
What would you say to someone that said, "Oh, Jesus paid for my sins. He died for my sins. His blood covers me. I'm saved because I believe in him. I have faith in him. So my sins are taken care of. I never have to step into a church again."
That's the other extreme, right?
That's the other extreme.
So I'm saying both extremes are wrong. To me, never going to church and missing church once a week, they're both opposite ends of the spectrum. To me, I should want to go to church, and I do go to church, and I love church, and I don't miss church. However, if something happens and I do miss church, and I have a terrible Saturday, and I totally fumble, and I oversleep, and it's my fault, I don't think God's looking at me going like, "You're going to hell, kid."
And that's what the Catholic Church teaches.
You just said that's not what it teaches.
No,
though.
because it's not your fault. Because you.
No, what if it is my fault? What if I was irresponsible Saturday night? I stayed out too late. I couldn't get up in the morning, and I totally blow it. And it is 100% my fault that I missed.
Did you have full consent of the will and full knowledge that you were going to miss church?
I think there's a time where Christians will have full consent of the will.
Full consent of the will,
I think so.
Full consent of the will to fail to give something that is owed to God.
If someone oversleeps, because they stayed up late because they were irresponsible, is that a consent of the will? They knew they were going to have church in the morning and they oversleep.
Did they intend it? So did they actually intend?
Well, then you get into intent, and
so that's what mortal.
Like,
that's what you need intent for mortal sin.
Sure. Okay.
If your intent is not there, if you did not have the intention
what about
of committing the mortal sin,
what about a flippiness? Like
flippiness is also.
I don't care. I know I got to be up early in the morning, but I'm going to stay up.
Gravity. This is where we get into the gravity, right? Let's say that we miss church because I intend to miss church. I know I'm not going to go to church. But then let's say we missed church because I was flippant about it, and because I was flippant, I didn't make it to church. Now, one is a grave sin. The other, if it's not a grave sin, then guess what? It's not a mortal sin. It does not remove you from grace.
Okay. So I'm saying the person. Here, let me paint it very simply for you. The person that stays up until 3 o'clock in the morning, knowing they got to be at church at 9, to me is no different than the person that goes and says, "I don't want to go to church today." It's the same thing. You came to the conclusion that you were irresponsible either way. You chose not to do something. You still fell short. And I'm saying I think Jesus covers both of those sins. Now, if you go on practicing and flippantly living like that, I would question, do you love Jesus at all? Right. So that's where me and you would probably disagree.
So here's the symmetry breaker, as we call this. So let's say that we do it just once, right? It was just the one time, but then you never, you go the next, for 4 or 5 years without ever missing, If you missed it that one time, but then the next week you were back in church and all of those other, you were back in church, then that one time that you missed it over here on the timeline, that was most likely not a mortal sin. It most likely was not your intention to miss it. So if you missed it because you were being flippant, now your sin is being flippant, but that's not grave, as opposed to I'm going to miss because I refuse to go, right? So that's the difference. You have to have all three.
Sure.
Even if you would say
flippant. So that's where we would disagree. I would say flippantness in falling short still has the same consequences and impact.
It has the same consequences.
And I would say it's the same reflection of your heart of you did not care enough to prioritize doing the thing you were committed to do. And to me, it's the same. It's the same end result.
It's the same end result.
And I would say it's the same heart. I would say whether you're falling short or intentionally waking up and going, "No, I'm not going to go to church because I met God," or whatever. It's the same thing to me.
You get the same result, but the person.
I'm saying to me, it's the same result to me.
But what about to God? Is God going to judge both of those people in the same way?
I think it's very similar, man. I think it's very simple. I don't want to speak for God because I don't want to do that. But I'm saying, like, if my son wakes up and intentionally disobeys me, versus if he does a bunch of stupid things to then disobey me.
Right. Yeah.
You still disobey me, kid.
Right.
There's still consequences.
Ultimately, your son failed to fulfill the justice of obeying his father.
Yes.
But then the question is, how culpable is he? How culpable is he for doing it?
In the example I'm saying, in my paradigm, I think he's just as culpable, and the consequence will probably be the same. Whether you were irresponsible and neglected something you should have done, and that's why you didn't get it done, or whether you got up and from a hardened heart or frustrated heart decided not to do it. In my home, you failed, and there's consequences.
So now notice this: we've just flipped the tables because this whole conversation, what you've told me is, man, that seems like a disparity.
Yeah.
But now we flip the tables, and I can say to you, hey, man, that seems like a disparity. These are two different situations, and like how are you going to blame
in terms of the kid?
In terms of, like, you had this kid that he's young, his brain isn't fully developed. You know, staying up all night playing video games. What do you expect? He's a kid. But here, this other kid, he's saying, I'm not going to go. I don't want to go to church. I hate church. I hate God. And you're saying that it's the same thing.
No.
So now I can flip the table.
No, I'm not, because
now we can flip the table.
Because the consequence isn't he's getting kicked out of the house. The consequence is not he's not mine no more. The consequence is not any of that stuff. The consequence is there's probably going to be a natural consequence that he has to deal with, right? And again, it's a metaphor. It's flawed.
Right.
And then the consequence. So you're saying, though, well, the kid that wanted to be angry at God, at his father, kick him out of the house. But the kid that stayed up all night playing video games, being irresponsible, not listening, he was inculpable. And I would say they were both culpable, and they were both bad kids.
I know how we can get to the bottom of this. Okay. I know how to get to the bottom of this.
All right, let's get it.
Venial sin is when you mess up.
What is it?
A venial sin. Sin that is not mortal. When you mess up for whatever reason that it is, you mess up, but you're not kicked out of the house. Mortal sin is, I don't want to be in this house. That's what mortal sin is. Mortal sin is, I don't like this house. I hate this house. I don't want to be in this house. I am removing myself from this house. That's what mortal sin is. So when you think about it, it's actually kind of difficult to commit a mortal sin, because a mortal sin is actually, you are completely, with all of your will, with all of your knowledge, with everything that you are and every fiber of your being, I don't want to be with God, and I know what God wants, and I don't care what God.
So I see what you're saying. Okay, so don't you guys have other pretty gnarly mortal sins? Like if you have sex and you're not willing to have a baby, isn't that a mortal sin, or am I tripping?
If you have sex and you're not willing to have a baby?
From my understanding...
Oh, contraception?
Not contraception. Pulling out. I don't mean to be graphic.
So somebody in the Old Testament got struck dead by God for pulling out.
So that would be a mortal sin.
It's a grave sin. It's a grave sin. So remember, we have to see, is it grave? Did you do it with full consent of the will, and did you do it with full knowledge? Let's say that you're fornicating, and you're fornicating, you're using condoms, and you pull out, so you do the trifecta, right? That's a grave sin.
That's not a mortal sin.
That's a grave. Let's see. It's a grave sin, objectively speaking, but now the question is, did you know it was a grave sin? Did you do it deliberately? And meaning, I know that this, I know that this is offensive to God. I'm going to do it anyway because I care more about my pleasure than I care about God. And I'm going to do it because I really deep down don't care what God has to say about this. Then it would be a mortal sin. But if you're a kid and you're fornicating, you're using condoms, you're pulling out, you're doing all that, but you're not thinking about, you're not thinking about what does God want from me? Is it a mortal sin? It's grave. Objectively, it's grave. But the morality...
I'm asking you in the context of a marriage.
Right.
If someone's in a marriage...
Oh, in a marriage, okay.
So someone's in a marriage. And again, I'm asking, I don't know.
Right.
Someone's in a marriage. They have 3 kids.
Right.
They can't afford any more kids.
Right.
They're still going to have naughty time.
Right.
I use that word naughty, so I'm going to use the
naughty.
They're going to have naughty time.
I would say that the marital act, it's not naughty. I'm
messing with you. I understand. I know. They're going to be intimate. They're going to consecrate their marriage. And they go, I got 3 kids.
Yeah.
We homeschool the kids because we don't like the education system.
Right. Yeah.
Right. My wife's a stay-at-home mom.
Right.
I'm a blue collar guy.
Right. Yeah.
Can't afford any more kids.
So far, you're perfect. You're perfect.
Right. And so we're smashing.
Right.
And it's the 4 or 5 days in the cycle where she's fertile.
Right.
If we have more kids right now,
it's gonna
be hard. Or if we have more kids right now, the last 2 she had a really bad birth and she could potentially
get
right.
Right.
And so in that, we are going to not. I'm trying not to be as graphic. I'm going to pull out.
I know what you mean.
Right?
Yeah. Right.
Is that a mortal sin?
So, pulling out is a grave sin,
but not a mortal sin.
It's objectively grave. But now here's the issue. So your intentions, because the Catholic Church teaches, if you want to space your kids out for financial reasons, you have. Not only do you have the right, you have the obligation to do that. You shouldn't be bringing kids into the world. You shouldn't be bringing
that you can't take care of.
That you can't take care of. Right? You have an obligation to take care of your kids. So you're totally perfect up to that point. If you tell your wife, hey, let's hold off on having another baby. Let's wait maybe a year or 2 before we have another baby. You have your right to do that. Now the question is, how are you going to do it? Because I'm sure.
So is there a way to do it that's not in sin?
Yeah, there's plenty of ways to space out your. We have what's called natural family planning.
We do natural family planning. I'm with you guys.
Perfect. So, for example, because we do have a spectrum of extremes. So let's say that a married couple, they're married, and they're like, we can't have a baby right now. So I'll tell you what, babe, if we have naughty time and we make a kid, we'll just go down to Planned Parenthood and we'll.
That's terrible.
That's terrible, right?
It's terrible.
So, but it's the same thing. It's the same result.
Yeah.
If you pull out, she's, but if you go and you just abort it, the point is we don't have a kid. We're not going to have a kid.
Right.
So now what it is how are you doing it? What is the means?
Okay.
If
you're not comparing those two as the same.
No, they're
right?
not the same.
Okay.
Right?
I just want to make sure I'm tracking.
They're both objectively immoral and grave, but pulling out is one thing, but killing another human being, that's murder. Now you're guilty of murder.
And that would be a mortal sin.
That's object. So this is when we get into law, right? Yeah. If you kill somebody, murder is a legal term. If you kill somebody on accident, they can't charge you with murder. You can get manslaughter. If it wasn't your intention, if it wasn't your intention, they can't charge you with murder.
Sure.
If you did it with intent, now you're a murderer, right? So pulling out and getting an abortion are two very different things.
Gotcha. Okay.
One is the objective evil of murder, because you are actively saying the goal is to kill this baby that we just made. One is murder, and the other is abuse. When you pull out, you are committing a disordered act, and you are abusing not only yourself but your spouse. So which is worse? Murder is way worse than pulling out. They're both objective sins, and they're both grave sins. But again, this one is here, this one is here. And then the question is, for both of these, did you have full knowledge and you have full consent? It's more likely that the person that kills their baby, they're doing it with full knowledge and full consent of the will. The person that pulls out, first of all, I mean, like if you're, having naughty time or whatever, you're probably not thinking clearly. So you maybe you don't have full consent of the will, or you don't have full, you can't, you know what I mean? Yeah. So ultimately, only God can judge your intentions, your level of knowledge, and the state of your will. For example, let's say someone is addicted to pornography, and someone is seriously addicted to pornography, and they can't help it. They watch porn all the time. They abuse themselves all the time because they have an addiction. Is that a mortal sin?
Is that a mortal? I would say we go back to the intent. Was
that a mortal sin? If someone is addicted and
you're the Catholic.
They can't help it, what do you think the answer is? What do you think the answer is?
I would say that if someone is addicted to something, I don't think it's the same.
You're right. You're correct.
Okay.
If you're an addict, you no longer have full consent of the will. Your will has been compromised, and because your will has been compromised, and you're addicted to whether it's pornography, alcohol, you're an addict, and you couldn't stop even if you wanted to. It's not mortal because you don't have full consent to the will.
Yeah, I guess I think parents trying to do family planning and knowing that she's fertile in those days. I don't know if you would say that that's not consenting and knowing exactly what you're doing. I don't want to have a kid right now, therefore I'm going to not make sure that the sperm is near the egg. That sounds like a pretty consenting.
So there's a way that you can abuse natural family planning, but what the church teaches is that you as a married person, you have the right to the marital act at any time. At any time, you have the right to enact. Because think about it. If it was a you could say that, okay, whenever I have relations with my wife when she's not fertile, the Catholic Church doesn't say you can only have relations when you're both fertile. If you're not fertile, don't even no. The Catholic Church says you can have relations whenever you want. When she's fertile, when she's infertile. The Catholic Church doesn't say that once a woman reaches menopause, she can no longer have relations because it's impossible to. Because the marital act is there's more to it. The ultimate goal is for procreation, but there's more to it than just that. So if you are going to only engage in the marital act with your wife when she's infertile, there's no sin in that because it's natural to have relations with your spouse, whether you're fertile or infertile. There's nothing objectively immoral about that.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't be sinful.
You still didn't answer my question though.
What's the question?
Is pulling out while she's fertile, knowing you don't want to have kids because you can't afford any more, or just because you don't want to have more kids, because the birth was hard, because the pregnancy was hard.
That's a grave. That's
that objectively
is a grave. That's a grave sin.
Not a mortal sin.
That's a grave sin.
Is there any way that can be a mortal sin?
If you do it with full knowledge and full consent of the will, and when I say full knowledge, it means you know that this is sinful and you know that God disapproves of this, and you do it anyway. Now you have approached that mortal sin territory. So we always have to ask two questions. Is this objectively grave? That's the first, And if the answer is no, then it's not a mortal sin.
Sure.
You need to have all three. You need to have all three present in order for it to be mortal. If it's objectively grave and the answer is yes, then you move on to the next two questions. And if the answer is yes to those two, right? And your intent, what is your intent?
Yeah.
Because that also has to do when we talk about full consent of the will and we talk about full knowledge, right? Intent has to do with that full knowledge part. Is your intention to disregard God? Let's say that somebody is, whether you're married or not married, and you're literally in the act, and in your mind you're thinking, God, I'm so sorry. I don't want to do this. I know I shouldn't be doing this, and I'm doing it anyway. I'm so sorry. And you pull out, but you're actually like, you feel terrible
you're
about
repentant
it,
for it,
and you're like, I'm so, and you know, I know it sounds funny, but like,
it's funny because everybody knows, bro.
Everybody knows.
Right? So what I'm asking you, and I'm not trying to pin you down.
So the answer,
you're saying it can be a mortal sin for someone to pull out, and they can go to hell for it.
In that situation, if you pull out and you're like, God, I know
I'm saying, say they're not saying
it's not mortal.
Okay, so
it's not mortal.
But again,
because you're not doing it with hatred for God.
Alec,
you're not doing it disregarding God.
I know that.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, if someone is a Christian going to church, say they've never missed church,
right? Yeah.
And they're being intimate, and they're like, I don't want no more kids. My wife doesn't want no more kids. We're not gonna have any more kids.
Right.
We are going to
get our tubes tied or whatever.
Well, or vasectomy. Is that a mortal sin?
That's a grave sin because it is. Remember, you don't jump to the is it mortal first. Is it grave?
Okay, so it's a grave sin.
It's a grave sin because it's mutilation. You are mutilating yourself.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but what I'm saying is, it sounds like you're saying, yes, someone can be a mortal sin with the potential of damnation, eternal damnation, if they pull out because they don't want any more kids. I'm just trying to get clarity on that.
So no. Watch. If you're doing it because you hate God, or you're doing it because you know what God wants and you're gonna do, what God disapproves of, and you're gonna do it anyway. You're doing it fully knowing that God said don't do this. Right? If you're doing it just because you don't want kids, then your intention, right, that has to do with full knowledge. Then your intention, that full knowledge part, that part probably is not present. That part is probably not present because knowledge and consent of the will, when you put those together, what makes a sin grave is that you're doing it because you don't love God. That's what it is. You don't want to be in His house. You would rather pull out and not get a girl pregnant and be outside of God's house, right? Than to stay in His house.
Are you saying that the consent or the knowledge, because financially they can't provide, is that what you're saying, changes the consent aspect? Or
so if you're doing it because you really have this strain on you, like financially, guess what that has done? That has now diminished your will. You don't have full consent of the will.
That's a better answer. I got to answer.
I'm sorry it took me so long to get to that.
It took you a long time. I'm glad I got to answer. So what you're saying is, let me get this straight.
Yes.
If you're, let's paint a picture.
Yes.
If you're well off financially,
right? Yeah.
And there's not any serious health complications, meaning you're not 45, 50 years old trying to have another kid.
If you're not thinking about the health complications or your money when you're having relations.
Like, remove those two things.
Right.
And two consenting adults, they got 4 kids.
Right.
They just don't want any more kids.
Right.
And they're going at it. And they're going to church. They're living generous. They're reading the Bible.
Yeah. And they pull out whatever.
They pull out.
It's objectively grave because it's an abuse of the marital act.
But then, is it mortal?
If there are reasons for it,
there's no other reasons for it. There's no other reasons. They just don't want no more kids.
It would be mortal sin.
You can go to hell for that.
It would be mortal sin, and it can cost you your salvation because you have full consent of the will. You have no other mitigating factors that would influence your will.
Yeah.
You are perfectly free to do it, and you decide the wrong thing.
Yeah.
That is what puts you in mortal sin.
All right.
But
we got an answer out of it. I love it. Okay, thank you for answering that. Because I've always understood that to be the regular teaching of the church. It's like, hey, if you can have more kids, keep having more kids.
Right, but the church always says you can space your kids out as well.
Sure.
The Catholic Church says that you're not obligated to have a whole bunch of kids. All the Catholic Church says is be open to life. That's all it says.
Got it.
Be open to it. If you engage in the marital act with your spouse and God gives you a baby, then thank God for it and you be a parent. That's all it says. But the Catholic Church isn't saying every time that you have engaged in the marital act, you have to make a baby. The church doesn't say that.
Hey, we're going to go to the Patreon-only extended version of this conversation. It's a little too much for YouTube. So consider signing up for a free 7-day trial where you could see the entire conversation and get access to all of our future podcasts, be able to interact with our guests, and much more. Here's a little preview of what's available on Patreon. I'll see you over there.
There are Catholics that are protesting the Pope, and they still like the title of Catholic, and they still want the title of Catholic. But by definition, I can say you guys have muddied the waters because now we have thousands and thousands and thousands of denominations.
Well, we don't have thousands. That's an exaggeration. There's like hundreds.
With all due respect.
Don't say the 30,000.
I have the last numbers that I checked. It's actually now in the 40,000.
No,
with evangelicals.
I think there's a lot of additions. Even through this conversation, like you've had to explain things to me multiple ways and help me understand the schism over the Mass, the Latin Mass, and like the Mel Gibson types.
The red trad Catholics.
Yeah, and you're saying no, there has to be this other priesthood, and we have to create this disparity between clergy and laity. And I'm just saying, I just don't see that in Scripture.
Ruslan.